We have Jennifer Winter, David Hart, and moderating this panel is Maria Bandy from the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and thank you very much for the three of them for taking this away. Okay, so if we can just make sure that even if you're getting coffee, if you could do that as quietly as possible, and we'll get the discussion going. Thank you.
All right, well, thanks very much, Andrew, and good morning, everyone. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel, and we have not just one, but two very hard acts to follow. So 2 years ago, exactly on this day, the Paris Agreement was signed. It was a historic moment. And today, France is hosting the One Planet Summit in Paris. So really, there couldn't be a better moment to be talking climate policy. And one of the most striking features of the Paris Summit to me was the number of governors, premiers, and mayors attending the summit. They were not negotiating. They do not have even legal authority to sign it or to ratify it. But they were there sending the message that this is important and that we need all hands on deck. And we heard this from the premiers and the governor this morning as well. So it is my great pleasure to introduce two experts to discuss the subnational and federal interaction, the interplay, both in Canada and the United States, Dr. Jennifer Winter and Professor David Hart. Dr. Jennifer Winter is Assistant Professor and Scientific Director of the Energy and Environmental Policy Research Division at the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. She also directs the Canadian Network for Energy Policy Research and Analysis. And Jennifer's research is focused on the effects of government regulation and policy on the development of natural resources and energy and the consequences and trade-offs of energy development. Jennifer has published widely in this field. She's also actively engaged in increasing public understanding of energy and environmental policy issues and has been recognized for her efforts as by the Young Women in Energy Award, as well as being named one of Alberta Oil Magazine's top 35 under 35 last year. And prior to joining the School of Public Policy, Jennifer worked at Human Resources and Skills Development Canada, and she also serves on the Future Leaders Board of Directors of the World Petroleum Council Canada and is a member of Global Affairs Canada's Environmental Assessment Advisory Group. Welcome, Jennifer. David Hart is Professor and Director of the Center for Science, Technology, and Innovation Policy at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University in Washington, D.C. Professor Hart also holds appointments as Senior Fellow on Clean Energy Innovation Policy at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation. He's also non-resident Senior Fellow at the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution and is the co-chair of the Innovation Policy Forum of the National Academies. He also served in the Executive Office of the President 2011-12, and his books include Unlocking Energy Innovation, The Emergence of Entrepreneurship Policy, and Forged Consensus, Science, Technology, and Economic Policy in the United States. So please join me in welcoming our two speakers. So the format for this session is going to be similar as we have seen before. We will start with some opening remarks from our speakers, then we will have a bit of a conversation about climate policy, and then we will open the floor to questions. So without any further ado, let me start with you, Jennifer. Are national governments the only actors that can ensure sufficient climate progress, or is there a leadership role for the subnationals as well?
So I would say no, but with some caveats. And when we're thinking about, say, the interaction of energy policy, environmental policy, and climate policy specifically, I think it's important to note the fact that these are issues where there's joint jurisdiction between the federal government and the provincial and territorial governments. And also the fact that the Constitution is silent on the environment, though it does clearly distinguish between federal powers and provincial and territorial powers in terms of energy. And it's also important to acknowledge the distribution of energy resources across the country and how geography and that distribution of resources has driven energy policy as well as environmental policy over the history of Canada and even more recently. And I think I want to characterize the evolution of Canadian environmental policy in two ways. And I'm talking more recently in terms of the evolution of policy. I think I would say it's been a move away from regulation to explicit market-based policies like the carbon taxes in Alberta and BC, like cap and trade in Ontario and Quebec, and like the federal backstop. And I also think we can characterize the evolution of environmental policies and climate policy more specifically as a move away from using energy policy to achieve environmental policy goals, and a move towards having environmental policies specifically directed at addressing these environmental problems. And of course there are exceptions to this. I mean, how could there not be with 14 jurisdictions to deal with? And then I think another comment I want to make is that we want to be careful in how we define what is leadership in this space. And that we could define leadership as doing something. Is it doing something to meet a target? Is it doing something visible that's politically costly? Is it doing something visible that is inefficient but very salient to voters? And so when we're thinking about leadership, we want to consider the cost, the efficiency, the visibility, political salience, et cetera, et cetera. And when we think about these different characteristics, we can characterize different provinces as leaders and different provinces as laggards. And I think another issue is, of course, the interaction between federal and provincial jurisdiction, as I mentioned, and how some provinces, such as, say, Saskatchewan, are using the discussion around climate policy to try and expand their jurisdiction, whereas, or say as a lever to expand the power that they have, or in the case of Alberta, to get something for the federal government, in that Premier Notley said that Alberta wouldn't sign on to the federal backstop unless there was a pipeline approval. And so, I mean, this is wrapped into all of these policy developments, this negotiation between what the federal government wants, what the different provinces want, and what individual provinces want in terms of their role in Canada. And this leads to conflicting objectives, clearly, in that, we would all be better off if and by say we, Canada, if the provinces could just agree to do the same thing. It would be less costly for businesses, less costly for households, we'd have more consistent policies, but at the same time, that's extremely unlikely. And it's also, in some sense, bad for Canada in the way that it's good to have policy experimentation, and it's good to have the provinces learn from each other's experience. That said, I think the federal backstop plays an important role in equalizing the cost of climate policies and the stringency and the coverage over time. And I think that's also important because there is a tendency for provinces to want to, call it lead by following, in that in BC and Alberta, there is an explicit policy direction that's like, okay, yes, we want to have carbon taxes, but only if everyone else is doing something too. So it's, they want to be thought of as the leader, but not necessarily out on the forefront of policy. Or if they are on the forefront of policy, it's much better to blame the federal government for pushing them than to be blamed for imposing costs on their citizens themselves. And I think that a specific concern right now, of course, is how costly climate action is going to be in Canada. especially with not everyone moving as quickly as Canada, or in the case of the United States, potentially drawing back. And that is a definite consideration when we're thinking about the evolution of climate policy and how specific policies will be enacted. And I want to, I think, close by noting that an outstanding question that's going to define federal, provincial, territorial relations in the near future around climate policy is the equivalency of each province's policies relative to the carbon, the federal carbon pricing backstop. In that, if you interpret the federal government's discussion paper one way, it looks like all emissions will be priced, not just combustion emissions. And in the case of, say, Saskatchewan, where they're choosing not to go the direction of explicit carbon pricing, there's going to be a lot of negotiating over the equivalencies of the implicit carbon cost of Saskatchewan's policies relative to the federal backstop. And then when you compare the Quebec, Ontario, California cap and trade system to the federal backstop and the carbon taxes in Alberta, BC, and the other provinces that adopt the federal backstop, projections on the minimum price for the cap and trade system right now are lower than the federal backstop once the federal backstop gets to $30 a ton. And so that's going to create quite a bit of discord across the country in terms of, the provinces who have adopted the carbon tax are going to be talking about how they are doing more because they face a higher price relative to the cap and trade provinces. And I think one of the issues when we're thinking about the federation is how much cooperation will there really be? And as I mentioned before, given the different approaches to carbon pricing and emissions reduction policies, provinces have the opportunity to learn from each other. And I just think, as much as policy coordination would be ideal, the specific circumstances in each province preclude that level of policy coordination, in that, a focus in Alberta is emissions intensive and trade exposed industries. A focus in Manitoba is going to be reducing emissions from agriculture, since it's a much larger portion of Manitoba's economy. And so that necessarily means different policies to address these different problems. And I think with that, I will turn it over to my colleague for his US perspective.
Great, well, thanks very much, Jennifer. And there will be a couple of points there I think we can come back to around policy experimentation and leading by following. But David, Mayor Bloomberg has said that Americans don't need Washington to meet their Paris objectives. Would you agree? And what is the situation on the ground?
So my short answer is I don't think I would quite agree. But let me first say what an honor it is to be here. When I accepted Andrew's invitation, I had no idea what I was getting into. This grand venue and the 50th anniversary of a landmark conference, not to mention the second anniversary of the Paris Accord. So it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to say thanks to the organizers for including me. I will address the elephant in the room first, which is it's a little bit embarrassing to be an American these days, abroad, especially speaking about climate change and the environment. Andrew, in his opening, referred to the Canadian principles of leadership and dialogue. The Quebec Premier talked about empathy, and I'm afraid all those qualities are in short supply in the United States these days. And so that's why I'm very grateful we have a federal system. Thank goodness we have divided authority in our country. And while the federal government has been pulling back from global leadership and climate change, other actors have been stepping forward, and Mayor Bloomberg and others are to be commended. Now, as I said, I don't think that that's enough in the long run, but in the short run, I think it plays an important role. So the states and the federal government are somewhat less interactive in the United States than in Canada, so I thought I'll take a little bit of a different slant to set up the discussion than Jennifer did. So I'm going to walk through the various emissions sectors and talk a little bit about what states have leverage over in the United States and which they don't. Talk a little bit about what's happened since President Trump announced that the US was going to withdraw from the Paris Accord, and look forward a little bit. I think there are roles that the federal government has to play, and so I'll conclude with those. So state leadership in the United States is not new. There has been a decoupling of carbon emissions and economic growth in the United States. So between 2005 and 2014, we've had a net decline of 11% in our CO2 emissions, while the economy has grown at 15%. So that's a pretty dramatic change from historical trends. Of course, our economic growth has been disappointing, but it's, I think, a real change, and I think that this decoupling will continue as our economy continues to grow more quickly now. Where the states have had the most leverage is in the area of electricity. Now, a lot of that is due to the substitution of natural gas for coal in power production, and that doesn't have a whole lot to do with the states. But the rise of renewables, which is starting to make a real dent now in the United States, has a lot to do with state policies, particularly something called the Renewable Portfolio Standards, or RPS policy. So these are requirements that utilities buy a certain share of power from renewable sources. And this has been responsible for the rapid expansion of the renewables market to the point where renewables are now competitive in many parts of the countries without any kind of requirement, although there is still a federal subsidy. So I think that's the area where we've seen the most state impact. In the building sector, somewhat less, although it depends from state to state. This is an area where cities and counties play a bigger role, but we've seen the diffusion of green building codes, green building incentives across the United States, and California has been a particular leader at the state level as well, and that's really true across the whole range of areas that impinge on our emissions. California is the standout. So in transportation, for instance, California actually has a special legal role under the US Clean Air Act. It can set vehicle standards, whereas no other state can do that, and it has exercised that authority in the area of hybrids first and now in electric vehicles, so California is leading the way there. In industrial decarbonization, there's a lot less, I think, that the states can do. And then finally, more general climate change policies. We have 20 states that have some kind of emissions target, so less than half of the states, and 10 have some form of carbon price, notably California, as we've heard already today, in association with Quebec and Ontario. And then something called what we call RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is the northeastern states, also have a carbon pricing policy. And this is a similar block with California and the West Coast and the northeastern states that we see across climate policy. Since the pullout from Paris, or the announcement that the US would pull out, as probably most people here know, the US can't actually pull out until after, I believe it's the day after our 2020 presidential election. So we've only announced that we're going to pull out. And the US was present in Bonn in the recent COP23. But since the president made that announcement, we've seen a galvanization of non-federal actors led by states, led by Mayor Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, and Governor Jerry Brown of California. So this first manifested itself as the hashtag #WeAreStillIn. Some of you may recall that, and then that became something called the US Climate Alliance, which was 14 states and Puerto Rico. And that leveraged existing commitments, so things like the Under 2 MOU, which were pre-existing commitments that, of the sort that Maria alluded to, that had drawn governors and mayors to Paris in 2015. That has now become an organization called America's Pledge. So that's kind of the central focus of this activity at the moment, the pledge to continue working on the Paris targets. So they just produced a report for COP23 that included 15 states, 455 cities, 1,747 businesses, and 325 institutions of higher education. So that's the focus of it. They haven't really been able to give a good estimate of exactly what that adds up to, because these are overlapping commitments to some extent. But it's not trivial. Whether it will meet what Governor Malloy suggested would be the 2025 targets for the United States, I don't know. I think there's an open question about that, but it's important. Now, of course, it's not the same across the whole country, and it's worth bearing in mind that federalism was invented by our founding fathers in part to preserve slavery. So it accommodates very different political philosophies, and we see that in climate policy as well. We talk about this in the United States as blue versus red, so Democratic states being the blue states and Republican states being the red states. This isn't entirely determinative, so we've seen very rapid growth of renewable power in certain so-called red states. So Iowa now has the largest proportion of its electricity coming from renewables of any state, and it's a pretty conservative state. But it is generally true, and it's also the case that where we've seen progress in the so-called red states, it's in part because of motivations other than climate. So you won't see Republican governors saying that they're motivated by climate, even though they're very keen to defend their renewable power sectors. So in short, I think it's an important role, it's an ongoing role, and in this post-Paris pullout era, particularly important to send a message to the world. But as I said at the beginning, I think the federal role is ultimately indispensable. So my own expertise is in the area of technology and innovation, and this is an area where I think the federal government and the US government at a global level plays a critical role. A lot of the progress that we've seen in recent years is in part due to those investments that have been made over many, many years by the federal government. And the Trump budgets, quite frankly, are horrible. Now, Congress is holding the line to some extent, but over time, I think our innovation capacity is going to erode. It's going to come to Canada. We've seen President Macron of France recruiting American scientists to come to France. So there's some danger that the system will deteriorate over time, and I think that would be a big loss to the effort. We do need national standards in areas like appliances, cars, and so on, in industry. But I think the biggest risk is in global diplomacy. So I think Trump's posture has, at first glance, in some ways galvanized the rest of the world in the way that it galvanized the states and localities. But I'm a little worried that's going to be a waning effect. And ultimately, the US has to step up and take leadership in this area. And as I took a look at the Moet Center's report on Canada, I think as in Canada, we need all the different parts of our government doing their share. So states can do their share, but ultimately the federal government has to as well.
Well, great. Thanks very much, both. So I think there is a bit of a common story here that the subnational efforts are a complement to, but not a full substitute for federal action. So, but let me ask you now, there is an urgency here behind all of these efforts. The latest UN Global Gap report is out. We see that countries have pledged only 1/3 of the efforts that they should be doing to meet the Paris objectives. We know that Canada's emissions today are over 18% greater than they were in 1990. US emissions are over 3% higher. But there's also this patchwork of different national efforts, so the picture is quite complex. So the question is, how do we kickstart a race to the top? What are the kinds of mechanisms, tools, political processes that the more ambitious states and provinces could use to nudge their peers in the federal government to do more? Let's start with you.
Yeah, so it is a challenging question. I do think in the US system, most of it is about organizing and moral persuasion. There isn't a lot of leverage from state to state, so we don't have a formal negotiating process at this point. Possibly our Congress will eventually get back into the business of considering climate legislation. We see litigation. I'm not convinced that litigation is the best way to go. But we're seeing in the US, and not particularly in climate policy, but across the board, the courts are being asked to adjudicate fundamental disagreements amongst our other institutions, and I'm not sure they can bear that weight. So I'm concerned about that solution. But I do think that's an important way that we see states exercising their authority. For instance, there's a proceeding going on having to do with auto emission standards, which were agreed to under President Obama to go out to 2025. And the Trump administration has said it's going to reopen this. And as I said, California has a particularly strong leverage in that area. So I think it's part leading by example, part using these tools. But ultimately, I think no matter what the urgency may be, it's important to build a big coalition. We're going to need a big coalition. It's such a complex problem. It needs such tremendous action that if it takes longer we can build a bigger coalition, ultimately and this is true at the global level too. I think that was the lesson of the Kyoto Protocol. It has to be bottom up.
Mm-hmm. I'm glad you brought up litigation. I guess as a lawyer, it's obviously the tool that we think about, but in the Obama years, the state of Texas sued the federal government 48 times And so we might be seeing some of the same kind of trends emerge now as well.
Yes, indeed. They've been trading places. So it used to be that the red states were suing the federal government, and now the blue states are suing the federal government.
Yeah, interesting. What do you think, Jennifer?
So I think it's important to acknowledge that how much action to take, how quickly, is an ethical, moral question more than anything. In that we are imposing costs on ourselves, and where the benefits are diffuse, and the majority of the benefits will not be in Canada. And so this is, one of the issues we have to address, in that not only are we, do we have different values and perspectives and objectives in terms of not just climate policy, environmental policy, but also economic policy in each different province. We're thinking about this for 50 states, for many different countries around the world, and it's like, well, a grand coalition is nice, but I'm very skeptical in that, we've had these conferences, these negotiations where countries come together and agree that yes, we should do something about climate change, and there hasn't been a lot of actual action, or it's been very slow. So it's it's very encouraging to see Canada moved more towards carbon pricing, but at the same time, in order to meet our targets, we need a carbon price much higher than $50 a ton. And so what is the alternative? Do we have regulations and alternative policies that are actually much more economically costly and will only make a marginal change on emissions? Or are we going to start pushing at the international level to get everyone on board with a concrete action, like a global cap and trade system or a global climate pricing system, like carbon tax, to get a lot more movement? And at the end of the day, carbon pricing and how much carbon is related to global warming, it's a very slow control knob, and we also don't have the best sense of our impact on the climate in terms of the probability of catastrophic events, and that makes it even harder. So I don't know if we really have an answer, but I would say it's moral suasion in terms of this is an ethical problem that if we care about people in the rest of the world, we should be doing a lot.
Mm-hmm. Clearly, we're less of a litigious society as well.
Let me just put a brief plug in for R&D and innovation. So I don't think that we're going to get to where we need to go with today's technology. It doesn't mean that we should not take action, but I do think if we see progress in technology, that's going to make getting to the targets ultimately cheaper and easier and help build this kind of coalition.
Agreed.
Going back to the question of experimentation, one of the justifications for federalism is that individual subnational entities act as laboratories of democracy. And in 1932, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Breyer basically justified it in those terms. And Brandeis, sorry.
Even Breyer was young then. Yeah.
It's true. He wasn't even around at that point. And so one of the things that he said is that basically experimentation is good in areas where the citizens are behind certain novel social or economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. And so I just want to put a little bit of emphasis on this, without risk to the rest of the country. And maybe it is true of certain social mores or experiments, but does it work in the area of climate change, where one state's or one province's actions impose externalities and direct costs to the rest of the country? So does climate change fit in the federalist model, or do we need to maybe rethink how federalism applies in this particular area? Maybe let's start with you this time, Jennifer.
Okay. I think in the case of climate policy, it's like one province acting in advance of the others is actually a positive externality for the other provinces. And what I mean by that is, say, in the case of BC, when they implemented their carbon tax, it was the only province with the broad-based tax on combustion emissions, and that made living and doing business in British Columbia more expensive relative to other provinces. And so in the absence of action by any other province, there's going to be leakage of business activity to other provinces. And this is one of the key concerns in Alberta right now, is how much leakage there is going to be associated with not just the introduction of a carbon tax, but a continually increasing carbon tax. And so I think that that aspect of it does tend to undermine the actions that provinces and states and other subnational levels of government are taking. And so which is sort of what I meant by the leading by following. Mm-hmm. David?
So I think it's similar in the US. I do think that this is an area where there has been a lot of learning across states. So I mentioned the renewable portfolio standards. That is something that states copied from one another. Similarly, other areas, building codes. I think transportation is coming, so I think we'll see the RGGI states in the Northeast imitate California in that area soon. But of course, it has to come to completion. So what Brandeis was referring to was the social welfare policies. The North industrialized first, especially New England, started to pass things like unemployment insurance, maximum working hours, and so on. But these were ultimately picked up by the federal government. And we haven't seen that step in the United States. And that does need to happen in order to address this question of leakage. So I think we're still waiting for that process to be completed. I would say, rather than a new set of institutions, I think we need to recapture some of the old so-called cooperative federalism. So we're in a period of conflictual federalism. And of course, these fevers, I think, do ultimately pass. But we lose precious time, and that's kind of where we are at the moment.
And so, in terms of the areas where cooperative federalism could work or it doesn't work, what are the kinds of areas, maybe in your case, David, where the federal government is indispensable, and in your case, Jennifer, where provinces ultimately have the greater power to act, to the extent that there are certain carved out territories? So if we need to see action, what would those be?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately emissions controls are the key area for the federal government to set a minimum standard, and the U.S. tradition has been it's fine to go above that minimum standard. So most of our environmental policies are delegated to the states, but they have to meet a certain minimum standard, and then if they want to go beyond that, they're allowed to do that. So in areas like industrial regulation, if we're going to get control of industrial emissions, I mentioned already auto standards, but transportation emission standards in general. I mean, I think ultimately we should have some similar policy at a very generic level, like Canada does with carbon controls, but I think we're a long ways from seeing that now. We came close in 2009, 2010, but failed, and now we've moved, to our corners. We have extreme views on both sides, so I don't see a resolution to that. But ultimately, I think I would like to see us get there.
So being somewhat aspirational here, I think that there is a role when we're thinking about climate policy moving forward and interprovincial cooperation. In tandem with that should be a broader look at the ways in which provinces can cooperate. In that we know that with carbon policies, we're going to impose costs on the Canadian economy and the provincial economies. This is a reality. There's good justification for doing this, but there are going to be costs. And then so to sort of mitigate some of these costs, provinces should start looking at other policies that create frictions, such as internal trade barriers, things like that. So it's a real opportunity to have a look at not just cooperating on climate policy, but cooperating on other levels of policy so that we can mitigate and improve the state of the Federation.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So in the first panel, the two premiers were both quite reluctant about the idea of a new confederation conference, but you can imagine a grand bargain where these kinds of issues are back on the table.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be opening up the Constitution again. It can just be a commitment to doing things that might have short-term pain for individual provinces, but there's a gain for Canada, and that gain will translate into long-term gains to compensate for that short-term pain.
So we've talked about Canada and the US a little bit in isolation so far, but these are not two solitudes. And as we know, there is a lot of interaction across the border with the Western Climate Initiative, with even the latest North American Leaders Statement between Canada, Mexico, and the US Climate Alliance. So I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on how effective do you think that these subnational yet international agreements could be, either in terms of learning or implementation, and basically closing the ambition deficit?
I guess I'm a little skeptical. I have to say I don't know a lot about them. But so Jerry Brown went to China, appeared in the Great Hall of the People with Xi Jinping, and I think it was a wonderful photo op. There are some agreements between China and California that I think may make some difference on the margin, but it's a far cry from the US president, and the Chinese are well aware of that. So perhaps there's this learning by doing that occurs, as we discussed with the laboratories of democracy concept at the subnational level. But I have to say, probably count me as skeptical on that one.
Jennifer.
So I would say that there's some learning at the international level, but I guess I'm not quite a skeptic, but I know it is common for politicians to visit other jurisdictions on learning trips. We had city councillors from Calgary go to London, England, and I think Denver to learn about the transit system. And it's these are nice photo ops, but at the same time, what is, I think, potentially more valuable is if it's not necessarily the politicians, but the policy analysts supporting the politicians that do that sort of interjurisdictional learning. And I think, that's a way to move forward with international cooperation. I don't know how feasible, or even if it's feasible, or how much it's already done, but I would say that to me, it's far more important for the people, the gears, the cogs in the machine, to be learning from other jurisdictions.
So certainly at the federal level, I think that there may have been a little bit more of policy impact. So in the Harper years, I think we were using the US as an excuse not to act. And then at the tail end of the Obama administration, I think there was a bit of a liftoff, certainly on issues like methane, but perhaps there isn't the same kind of machinery at a level of states and provinces to move forward implementation. Let me ask you now a little bit about government and planning. So one of the key challenges in dealing with climate change are the long time horizons involved. We need to be thinking 50, 100 years ahead. We need to be thinking about infrastructure lock-ins, but governments are notoriously bad at long-term planning. And how do you see basically innovation and planning work at the state or province level, and how could it be made better in a way? And at the same time, I think I might also ask if there are any questions from members of the audience. We do have 2 mics at each wall, so I would like to invite you to line up if you have questions, and I'll let our speakers answer in the meantime.
Well, I guess I would say the way you sustain a long-term perspective is by building cross-sector coalitions. So we look at an economic development area. A state like North Carolina was very much part of the Southern economy, 60, 70 years ago. And they put together a real broad alliance with the business, with civil society leaders, to build a new kind of economic development strategy in which they first brought in manufacturing plants, but now have really built a big innovation economy there, and it was sustained regardless of who was in power. So I think that's a big part of it. We do have an area, the electric power planning process at the state level is pretty well established to take a long timeline perspective. They don't necessarily build these externalities in yet, but we are seeing increasing sophistication in this so-called IRP, integrated resource planning, at the state level. But I do think it's a fundamental challenge for any democratic system that the leaders, the leaders don't look past the next election, and quite frankly, the voters don't either. It's what have you done for me lately? So you need other institutions in society to be able to carry that burden.
I think there's a contrast in Canada in that it really depends on the jurisdiction and the level of political discourse. So if you contrast, say, Ontario right now, it's the debate between the cap-and-trade system advocated by the Liberal government and the carbon tax advocated by the Conservatives. Go to Alberta, and it's the carbon taxes advocated by the NDP government and sort of like do-nothing advocated by the Conservative party, unfortunately. And it's in Alberta in particular, it's very, very polarized and very divisive. And so we can't even get to a sort of long-term planning scenario if the two main political parties are still fighting over whether or not we need to take action. And then look at BC, where the question is more about how quickly to increase the price on carbon. And so, in that case, they have a stable policy action that everyone is essentially on side with. And that makes it easier to engage in planning independent of the political party. And so and even like at the federal level in Canada, we see a clear dissonance between what the Trudeau Liberals are saying and the Conservatives are saying around carbon pricing. And again, that makes it it's a very difficult business environment because it makes what happens after the next election, it's hard to plan for that. And so I would say it really depends on the jurisdiction and the political situation. And unfortunately, in a lot of places in Canada, we're not at a point where we can start doing serious long-term thinking.
Yeah, the polarization is quite interesting. If you look at public opinion maps, most Canadians and most Americans now do recognize climate change as a legitimate threat, but there's still a wide variety of opinion on how urgent it is, how much they're willing to pay for it, so all of that obviously feeds into reluctance. Do I see we have our first question? So if I could ask you to just briefly introduce yourself, your affiliation, and take it from there.
Sure. My name is Leslie White-Eye. I'm the former chief of Chippewas of the Thames First Nation and a current panelist here today. I'm just curious on what you think about the role for Canada, First Nations or Indigenous peoples in this movement in terms of climate change, and then I guess the question is for both of you, what does that look like in the States in terms of movement and change and climate change? And what role can they play effectively in that? And then the second question is around something similar to what happened in Standing Rock, the power of movement of people movements. Is that something that's going to happen in order to quicken up this process if we're talking about election cycles and everything that you just described as slowing it all down?
So this is a very, very complex policy area, and I want to acknowledge that first. And then, I can't necessarily adequately address all the points you've raised, but I think to start off with, the Canadian, the federal government and the provincial governments are very much focused on, their legal obligation and in some sense ticking boxes in terms of the duty to consult, but it's solely, or to me at least, it seems to be solely around resource development and not in other areas of policy. And then on top of that, we have different strategies, policies, et cetera, around consultation and engagement at the federal government and across the provinces and territories. And this is, I guess, one way to describe it is shameful, that there isn't policy consensus in this area, and it is not focused on the needs and traditions of Canada's Indigenous peoples. And so I think we're going to have to essentially take our learnings from those experiences in terms of resource development and try and learn from what we've done wrong and what we've done right, and then apply it to all the other areas of policy, specifically, and to address your question, specifically climate policy. And I think that these people's movements do have a very important role to play in terms of, it's essentially a very loud, putting our hands up, or your hands up, not to speak for Indigenous peoples, but it's saying, no, what is being done is not good enough, and the governments need to do better.
So I have to say, I don't know that much about Native American role in climate policy in the US. It seems to be less than in Canada. What I do know is that I don't think there's a unified position, and it depends in part on the situations of particular groups. So the Navajo tribe in the Arizona Four Corners area, they have a big coal power plant, and there's discussion of converting it, but certainly they have an economic interest in at least negotiating a good settlement on that. Whereas the Sioux in North Dakota, South Dakota, they don't have those kind of interests, and so they've taken different kinds of positions. I think your premise was that Standing Rock and that kind of protest would quicken the pace. I think in the US at the moment, it's probably produced as much backlash as it has progress. And this is a very tricky dynamic in any social movement, between the sort of pushing from the outside versus the more tedious process inside. I think where we are in the United States is that the pushing from the outside is not getting us to move forward. I don't think that that's an argument that folks who feel that strongly should stop protesting, but I don't think they're seeing the kind of results that they might have hoped for, and there could be actually some counter movement.
Just one more question to follow that up. That's under the assumption that jurisdiction isn't recognized in some real sense in terms of implementation. Should the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples be adopted as it's being proposed in the legislature right now, with the articles around free and prior informed consent, will that change the landscape in terms of that internal, intricate work that needs to be done to meet those now legislative requirements?
So with the caveat that I'm an economist, not a lawyer, I think it will change the tone of discussion, and I think it will change the discussion overall. But I also think it really depends on how it is implemented and adopted by the Canadian government, in terms of it traditionally or historically has been very easy for governments to say things and be essentially paying lip service to a policy without actually acting on it. And so I think it really depends on how serious the federal government is in terms of implementing it and actually living the implementation. And if they're serious about living the implementation, it's going to be a very long process to get where we want to be.
What might change the discourse a little bit would be a charter case. We haven't seen one yet, but in the United States, there was an attempt by the native village of Kiwalina in Alaska to basically get remedies because the village is sinking due to the impacts of climate change. And our Circumpolar Conference here in Canada also tried bringing a case against the United States, interestingly enough, not against Canada, before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. So this is another area, again, where we might see more of constitutional cases as well. So we've talked international layer, federal, subnational, Indigenous, we haven't talked about cities yet. Tomorrow there will be a panel here on cities as well, and obviously the cities are a major actor when it comes to climate policy. We see cities adopting very ambitious targets, Copenhagen, Boston, Toronto. How do you see the role of cities interacting with states and provinces? To what extent do you think these targets are just piggybacking on what the larger entities are doing, and to what extent do you think they can actually do a lot on their own?
So I think the answer is some of both. I think there are some jurisdictions, and I would mention Montgomery County, which is just outside of Washington, declared it's going to go to zero by 2035. I can't imagine it's going to go to net zero. So I think there's a certain amount of symbolic action that takes place at that level. But at the same time, I think cities are going to be ground zero for a new kind of lifestyle that is going to be low impact, more sustainable. If we're going to have a transformation of our transportation system, which I think we need to have, that's going to begin in the cities. I think we'll see cities declare some district to be the smart district, and it's going to be, you know, no internal combustion engines need apply. It'll be autonomous, you know, ride-sharing systems. And Copenhagen is leading the way. And here I do think there is a lot of cities paying attention to one another, thinking about how can they adapt their infrastructure. It's a long-term process, but I think many of them are serious, and not simply because they want to reduce the externality to the world, but they see that as an opportunity to attract people, an opportunity to build new industries. And I think that's very exciting. In fact, it may be the most exciting thing going on, because in the long term, if we're going to have this energy transition, it has to be something that people want to do, right? It's not going to be something that we tax our way into or that we force people to do. That's, at least for Americans, that's not the way we operate. I don't think it'll be successful. But if there's a lifestyle that people want to adopt, you know, that's transformative, and that's what I'm looking to the cities to do.
Mm-hmm. I think at the same time, it's going to be fairly challenging because of the existence of so much already built infrastructure, and sure, converting that or changing that is going to take quite some time. And a big part of the changes that cities will be an important part of and responsible for is sort of, you know, the land use planning and the zoning and things like that. And coming from Calgary, where we have a definite sprawl problem, you know, we have lots of space, so why not use it? And like everyone can have a nice big backyard and a nice big house. And so it's going to be, as you said, like something that people want to do, but it's also going to depend on, you know, gradually changing preferences for not having the big house and the like big truck and things like that.
Which raises also the question of whether there might be a need to rethink the balance of power between cities and provinces. So if a city wants to go, maybe get a little bit ahead of the rest of the province, sometimes we see provincial agencies shutting down certain good ideas, but I think we might have the next question.
Just very, very quickly, I wanted to ask...
It's a ringer here.
Pardon?
You're the ringer.
I wanted to ask Jennifer if she could just say, is there something a Toronto audience should be aware of how this conversation plays out either in Calgary or in Alberta or just in the West? We had two Central Canadian premiers on the stage today talking about their relationship of trust. It could have been, may or may not have been different if Brad Wall had been a third on the stage. And so just to try and simplify, are we in tune? Or is there a risk of not knowing how this conversation plays out in different parts of the country?
I think, the conversation is very different in Alberta. And like, as I mentioned before, the fact that Premier Notley is fighting very hard to enact a whole suite of climate policies in addition to the carbon tax. And she's getting substantial political opposition as well as, you know, substantial, I would say, tepid support from the general public, or tepid interest from the general public. And when it's right now, I mean, people in Alberta are still concerned about the price of oil and jobs and things like that. And a big concern is carbon tax is going to be costly, it's kicking the industry when it's down, that sort of thing. And so it's a very different environment. And I think there is a disconnect between the conversation in different parts of the country and at the political level. And I don't really know if there is a solution, because right now, Alberta, actually, every province has different values and different focus, but there is a bit of a sense, rightly or wrongly, that Alberta is a bit put upon right now by the rest of Canada. And I don't say this to be insulting, but just to acknowledge that opposition to, say, pipelines is very frustrating in Alberta, in terms of, like, yes, it will have an impact on production of oil and gas in Alberta, but it's also a very costly way to reduce emissions. And we're also talking about the livelihood of a good chunk of Albertans. And so, viewing, with that sort of context, it's not really surprising that Jason Kenney makes pronouncements about, relooking at equalization, and is, essentially riding a wave of populist discontent with the current government.
So this seems like an area where just transition and federal support for diversification might really make a difference.
Yeah, and there's also a bit of a national energy policy 2.0 sense as well, which is not accurate at all, but there is like still significant distrust of liberal governments and federal liberal governments in Alberta.
Mm-hmm. And what does the conversation look like in Texas, David?
Well, you have to remember I'm from Washington, D.C. I think the conversation in the South and in the Midwest is changing, mainly because the declining prices of renewables. That's becoming a more attractive investment opportunity, but we're still a long ways away. So I was reading a story on Florida. You would think Florida would have a good-sized solar power industry, but in fact only gets about 0.5% of its electricity from solar. And so, I guess this is my general reaction today, is like, boy, I wish I had your problems, Canada. So I think whatever there are issues between Alberta and the federal government, just multiply that to think about the issues between Texas and the federal government. The governor, one of the pathways to becoming governor of Texas is to sue the federal government. And that's what we see across the U.S. There are big incentives for holding out and taking the most extreme position, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I would just like to thank our two speakers for sharing their insights. There's a groundswell of action. We are still not where we need to be, but I think it's... Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say, don't give up on us, please. So, I think, see this action at the subnational level as, it is a genuine statement, I think, of popular concern, and it's not just confined to the states that are represented in the U.S. Climate Alliance or the We Are Still In. I think there are pockets of support everywhere in the country, and I believe we'll eventually come around. We just got to keep at it.
Mm-hmm. We'll just keep negotiating a bigger and bigger carbon market with more and more states every year.
Well, I do think that's part of it. Yeah, it's part of it.
Great. Well, thanks very much, both Jennifer and David, and please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.